Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on procurement management documents. Part 3. There are a few required elements for a contract to be legally considered a contract. They are the offer, acceptance, consideration, and intent. An offer is an offer on the part of the buyer to purchase certain products or services. The buyer needs to specify what he wants to buy. Acceptance is that the seller accepts the offer. The seller agrees to provide the buyer with the specified products or services. Consideration is typically the amount of money that the buyer agrees to pay for the products or services. However, it doesn't have to be money. It could be a trade for something else of value, some other product or service, such as stocks or stock options or bonds, things like gold or land or houses or cars, or even less tangible things like water rights or mineral rights. Consideration is usually money, but it doesn't have to be. It could be an exchange of just about anything of value. But both parties, the buyer and the seller, must exchange things of value, or else it's not a contract. It's still an agreement, but not a contract. The last element is intent. Both parties must enter into the agreement with the intent to be legally bound in order for the agreement to be considered a contract. Let's take a few examples. If you're buying something online, is that process considered a contract? Actually, it is. Does it include an offer and acceptance? Yes, you want to buy something and there's an agreement to pay a certain amount for it, so there's consideration there as well. And intent. Yeah, you do intend for this to be a legal transaction, so it is considered a legal contract. Now, not being face-to-face and not having witnesses makes this harder to enforce in the courts, but it's still a contract. You don't hear about such things going to court, not only because the amounts are typically too small to be worth it, but also because the credit card companies bear the risks, especially the risk of stolen credit cards, and they cover the costs in exchange for the percentage that they charge on each transaction. It's effectively a type of insurance that both the buyer and seller benefit from. But in the end, yes, buying something online is a contract. How about giving a gift? Is there something exchanged? Do you give something? Is there some offer? Yes. Is there acceptance of that offer? Yes. What about consideration? There shouldn't be consideration, but often there is an expectation of getting something in return, or at least an attempt to influence or bias the recipient of the gift. Which is why organizations and governments have limits on how much employees or government representatives can receive as gifts. But even when there is consideration involved in giving a gift, there is really no intent to be legally bound. So gift giving, even with expectations of getting something in return, is not a contract. What about an agreement that is sealed with a handshake? Is that considered a contract? If it's an unwritten agreement? If it includes an offer and acceptance of that offer, and includes some consideration in which both parties exchange things of value, then that leaves us with intent. They may well intend to be legally bound, but without specifically saying so, and without something in writing and witnesses of the agreement, it would be difficult to enforce in court, even if there is an intent to be legally bound. And if that's their intent, why wouldn't they put it in writing? And if they didn't put it in writing, you have to seriously question whether they really intended to be legally bound. In the end, although it can in theory be considered a contract, as a project manager, if you want to have a contract, make sure you do it formally, in writing, and in collaboration with your procurement department or legal counsel. By the way, when talking about contracts, I use the terms buyer, purchaser, and client interchangeably to represent the buyer of products or services. And I use the terms seller, vendor, contractor, and provider interchangeably to represent the seller of products or services. There are some distinctions between these terms when you're considering specific contracts and relationships, but when speaking in general terms, I don't worry about these distinctions. What could or should be in the contracts you have with suppliers? There I go again using another term interchangeably. By suppliers, I mean sellers of a contract. If the contract is to provide your project with materials or components, then the detailed specifications of those materials or components should be included in the contract. The same goes for services. If the contract is to actually develop certain of your project's deliverables, then you should include a procurement statement of work, or SOW, which is that portion of your detailed scope baseline that you want your seller to provide. Remember that your scope baseline includes your project scope statement, your work breakdown structure, and work breakdown structure dictionary, and this includes all of your details about the scope of the project. You should include the schedule, typically consisting of those key milestone dates that the seller must meet. Pricing and payment terms will need to be in the contract, including the payment schedule. Will the seller be paid up front or in installments upon the delivery and acceptance of key portions of the work at key milestones, or only after it's all completed? And if it's for goods that need to be shipped, who's going to pay for which portions of the shipping? Who will pay for insurance during shipping? When does ownership transfer to the buyer? Is it upon shipment or on delivery? And who will pay for customs? These are just a few of the many questions to be addressed, particularly for international shipping. The good news is that your procurement department will likely have standard policies and procedures for handling these issues, but you should be aware of some of these issues and how they can affect your project, so that you can effectively collaborate with your procurement department and manage your project's risks. You may also want to include how the seller's performance will be measured and reported, and you will certainly want to specify how quality will be inspected or verified, and what the acceptance criteria are, and how they will be applied, and by whom. Also consider what warranty obligations and future product support you want to have the seller be responsible for. Your contract may also include incentives for things like delivering early, and penalties for delivering late or for poor performance. And speaking of performance, large contracts, especially with government agencies, typically require the seller to purchase insurance or performance bonds to cover the costs if the buyer is not satisfied. If it's important to you, the contract should also specify whether the seller can use subcontractors and what your rights are in approving or rejecting specific subcontractors. Your contract will undoubtedly include lots of general terms and conditions, the boilerplate, if you will, that has been crafted by your procurement department and legal counsel. If the general terms and conditions don't already cover it, then the procedures for handling change requests should be spelled out in detail in the contract, so that you can hopefully handle changes smoothly and without having to rewrite the contract. Your general terms and conditions will also include a termination clause, which specifies the conditions under which the contract can be terminated and the procedure for it. And many contracts these days will also specify alternative methods for handling disputes, such as mediation by a third party, prior to or instead of going to court to resolve disputes. Now it's time to take our next step in this journey and talk about the various different types of contracts, which can be grouped into 3 categories: fixed price contracts, cost reimbursable contracts, and time and materials contracts. As the name suggests, fixed price contracts specify a single fixed price for the products or services to be purchased. With a fixed price contract, the seller assumes the risk. If the products or services end up costing more than expected, the seller still has to provide them at the agreed fixed price, meaning that the seller will bear the losses. The seller could make less profit than expected, or could lose money on the deal. In the short run, this benefits the buyer, but in the long run, it can discourage the best vendors from working with the buyer. It can also encourage sellers to avoid pointing out gaps in the statement of work, and then to make most of their profit on expensive change requests once the buyer is locked into a contract and in the middle of working on the project. As you can see, fixed price contracts are more suitable for predictable projects that don't pose much risk to the seller. Cost reimbursable contracts specify that the buyer will pay whatever the project ends up costing the seller, plus a certain amount called the fee, which is the seller's profit. With cost reimbursable contracts, the buyer assumes the risk. If it costs more than expected, the buyer has to pay the additional cost. Such contracts will have controls in place to ensure that the costs are reasonable and not inflated. Otherwise, the seller won't have any incentive to keep costs under control. These types of contracts are best for unpredictable projects with more risk than qualified sellers are willing to assume in a fixed price contract. The procurement statement of work may be reasonably well defined, but the costs may not be predictable. Time and materials contracts reimburse the seller for the time they spend on the contract, usually based on a specified hourly or daily rate, and reimburses them for other expenses such as travel and accommodations. Time and materials contracts are typically used for hiring experts, consultants, or contractors to join, augment, or advise your project team. It's useful when you don't have a precise procurement statement of work, either because you don't have a precise scope baseline, or you want to have the flexibility to apply contractors on whatever tasks as needed during the project, without being limited to specific work packages. As there is no specific statement of work in a time and materials contract, the buyer assumes the risk that costs may be more than expected. However, theory and practice are not the same, and you have to be careful with time and materials contracts. Although the buyer assumes the risk, the buyer still has some expectations about what it will cost, and will be disappointed if it costs more than that, and it can affect the long-term relationship. Many of the projects that I've managed have been under time and materials contracts. On one of these projects, we had a job to convert an application from one platform to another. During the project, the client wanted to add a feature, which we agreed to do. But when the price of the project cost a few $1,000s more than originally estimated due to this additional feature, they weren't too happy about it. Even with a time and materials or cost reimbursable contract, the client does have expectations and a budget based on those expectations. And if you exceed that budget, it's going to cause problems. There's always a budget. Make sure you know what it is and what their cost expectations are, and manage those costs and expectations closely. There are a number of different types of fixed price and cost reimbursable contracts that include different types of adjustments. Some of the most common of these are firm fixed price, which is your basic fixed priced contract with no adjustment, fixed price plus incentive fee, abbreviated FPIF, fixed price with economic price adjustments, abbreviated FPEPA, cost plus fixed fee, abbreviated CPFF, which is your basic cost reimbursable contract with no adjustments, cost plus award fee, abbreviated CPAF, cost plus incentive fee, abbreviated CPIF, cost plus percentage of cost, abbreviated CPPC. The next couple of slides provide an overview of these different types of contract adjustments. A firm fixed price or FFP contract is your most common type of contract. It has no adjustments that you can make to it without actually amending the contract. The fixed price plus incentive fee type of contract, or FPIF, is a fixed price contract plus a bonus that's offered for some kind of benefit to the buyer, such as early delivery, or some extra features on the want but not must list, or for providing something that gives better performance, or higher quality, and so on. It really could be any kind of benefit to the buyer that the buyer identifies as worth providing an incentive for. Then you have fixed price with economic price adjustments, FPEPA. This is when you take a fixed price contract and you build in some adjustments for things like inflation or currency exchange rates. For example, you may have a contract that goes for several years and that stipulates that the price will change and be adjusted based on the consumer price index or some other index of inflation. Or you could have a contract that takes into account the exchange rate between currencies, between countries, and adjusts for those changes. Such changes to accommodate currency exchange rates can be critical to making sure that a long-term contract remains viable. In the cost plus fixed fee contract, abbreviated CPFF, the seller gets a fixed amount of money as their fee or profit. No matter how much the project ends up costing, the fee stays the same, unless the scope of the contract changes, in which case the fee can also be adjusted. The cost plus percentage of cost, abbreviated CPPC, is a contract that is a bit better for the seller because the fee or profit is set as a percentage of the actual cost of the project, so that if the costs go up, the seller still gets the same percentage of profit on the work. The cost plus incentive fee, or CPIF, contract has an incentive attached, just like for the fixed price incentive fee contract. But the cost plus nature of this contract means that there is no ceiling price on the total amount paid for the project. We'll get into the details of this ceiling price in just a moment. The cost plus award fee, CPAF, contract reimburses for actual costs, plus it has an award fee. But this is a risky one because it's mostly based on a completely subjective assessment on the part of the buyer. If the buyer's happy with the work, then they can award the fee. If not, they can withhold it. Without objective measures for determining this award, this can be risky for the seller. And this concludes part 3. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.